The rumble of the Harley echoed down the quiet street like a heartbeat refusing to fade, each thundering note a reminder of the years that had passed, the roads that had been conquered, and the battles fought both overseas and within. James Carter, a 62-year-old black veteran, sat tall in the saddle, his weathered hands gripping the handlebars of the bike that had been his one constant companion since returning home from war. The chrome gleamed in the fading light, polished by years of pride and care, and though his knees ached and his back no longer had the strength of his younger days, the machine made him feel alive in a way nothing else could. He called it freedom, not just because of the American flag decal on its side, but because it had carried him across deserts, mountains, and endless highways when the memories of gunfire and lost brothers became too much to bear. Tonight, however, the ride wasn't for joy, it was a farewell. As James pulled the bike into the driveway of the small, time-worn house he had lived in for decades, his chest tightened at the sight of the living room light glowing through the curtains. Inside, his daughter Monica sat hunched over a kitchen table covered in bills and prescription notes, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. In the next room, his 12-year-old granddaughter, Ava, slept fitfully, her frail body weakened by a heart condition that insurance refused to fully cover. The surgery she needed wasn't optional. It was the only chance she had to live past her teenage years. James had tried everything: savings, veterans' benefits, even the small pension from his factory job. It still wasn't enough. Freedom was all he had left that carried any real value, and selling it was the only way to bridge the gap. Standing in the garage, James ran his hand down the bike's polished tank, whispering a silent apology as if it were a friend he was betraying. He remembered the day he bought it, fresh from deployment, young and reckless, with wind in his face and the open road before him. That Harley had been more than a machine. It had been therapy, a church pew on wheels, and a brother when the silence of civilian life grew too heavy. But Ava's face flashed in his mind, her brave smile masking the pain she carried, and he knew there was no choice. Freedom had given him years, but Ava deserved decades. Early the next morning, he placed an ad online, his hands trembling as he typed the words he never thought he'd write: for sale, 1998 Harley-Davidson Softail. One owner. Immaculate condition. Price negotiable. By noon, the calls came flooding in, dealers trying to lowball him, collectors offering fast cash, even a few young men more interested in posing with the bike than riding it. James stayed polite, but inside he burned. This wasn't a toy, wasn't a shiny collectible. It was blood, sweat, and survival in steel and chrome. Finally, one buyer seemed serious, a man willing to pay close to what James asked, and by evening, the deal was done. James handed over the keys with a heavy heart, the sound of the engine roaring away down the street like a part of his soul being torn from him. That night, Monica hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "Dad, you saved her life." James forced a smile, but when he lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the silence felt unbearable without the Harley resting in the garage. He had given up his last piece of freedom, and though he told himself it was worth it, a question gnawed at him. What was a man without the thing that carried his spirit? The morning after John handed over the Harley, his modest house felt unbearably quiet. The old veteran had always drawn strength from the steady rumble of the bike that had been his companion through lonely nights and painful memories of war. Now, without it sitting in the garage, the silence weighed heavily on him like a stone pressing down on his chest. He walked into the garage, out of habit, his boots echoing off the concrete, only to be met with the barren space where chrome once gleamed. For a long moment he stood there, his weathered hands resting on his hips, trying to convince himself he had done the right thing. "It's just a machine," he whispered, but his throat tightened, and his eyes burned with a grief he hadn't expected to feel so sharply. That Harley wasn't just metal and wheels. It was history, it was healing, it was his freedom. Every mile he had ridden since leaving the service had been a piece of therapy, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. Now it was gone, but so was the look of pain on little Lily's face after the doctor's visit. The surgery was scheduled, and the money he had gained from selling the bike was enough to put down the deposit and secure her spot. That thought alone was enough to steady him, though it didn't erase the hollow ache gnawing at him inside. When Lily came over that afternoon, her hair in braids and her small body wrapped in a blanket, she noticed immediately that the garage was empty. "Grandpa, where's your Harley?" she asked, her innocent voice cutting through his chest. John forced a smile, crouched down beside her wheelchair, and touched her cheek. "I traded it for something far more precious," he said softly, kissing her forehead. Her wide eyes shimmered with confusion, but she didn't press, sensing the heaviness behind his words. That night, John sat by the window with a cup of black coffee, staring at the stars. He thought about the long rides he used to take along the coast, the brothers he once rode with in the army, and the way the wind always made him feel alive. He thought he had said goodbye to that part of his life forever, but little did he know, fate had a way of returning what was meant to stay. Because while John sat alone in his quiet house, hundreds of miles away, a group of riders with leather vests and roaring engines had already caught wind of his sacrifice. They weren't just strangers, they were men who lived by a code, and when they heard that a decorated veteran had sold his Harley to save his granddaughter, their blood boiled. The Hells Angels didn't turn a blind eye to a story like that. They respected loyalty, sacrifice, and brotherhood more than anything else. And John, without even knowing it, had just caught their attention in a way that would change everything. The day after selling his Harley, James woke up with an emptiness that went beyond losing a machine. It was as though part of his identity had been stripped away in silence. His little house, already quiet, now felt like a hollowed-out shell echoing the absence of the deep rumble that once lived in his garage. He sat at the kitchen table staring at his coffee, but the bitterness couldn't cut through the heaviness in his chest. Every creak of the old floorboards reminded him of the life he had lived before, the life where leather jackets and chrome pipes defined his freedom before doctors, bills, and responsibilities piled up like chains around him. He told himself he had done the right thing. His granddaughter needed him. Her life mattered more than his old road companion. But the memories of late-night rides under endless skies, of the laughter with other riders at roadside diners, of the wind tearing away the scars of war, all came back to haunt him. That Harley hadn't just been a bike. It had been therapy, escape, a reminder that the road was still his to command. Without it, the ghosts of combat and loss, once silenced by roaring engines, began to whisper louder in the corners of his mind. James thought of Sarah's smile when he told her the surgery money was secured. That memory was his anchor, but it also twisted the knife of sacrifice. He walked outside, his boots crunching against gravel, and stared at the empty space where the Harley once stood, a space that felt like a missing tooth in his life. Neighbors passed by, nodding politely, unaware of the battle raging inside him. As the sun climbed higher, James leaned against the fence and closed his eyes, remembering the day he first bought the Harley after coming home from the Gulf. The smell of gasoline, the feel of cool metal beneath his hands, the promise of freedom when he had felt most caged by civilian life. That bike had been there through funerals, through lonely birthdays, through the nights when the VA calls went unanswered and whiskey bottles emptied too quickly. It had been there when he had no one else, when he roared down highways just to remind himself he was alive. Now it was gone. But as much as James grieved, he also knew deep down that the sacrifice was pure. Sarah's health was worth more than chrome and steel. Still, the pain of loss throbbed like a phantom limb. He wondered if those who rode alongside him once would even understand what he had done, or if they'd call it weakness to give up the very soul of a rider. Yet that night, as he sat on his porch staring into the dark, a low growl of engines in the distance stirred his heart. It started faint, like an echo of memory, but it grew louder, closer, until the night air trembled with the unmistakable thunder of motorcycles rolling in unison. James froze, breath caught in his chest. His hands trembled as the sound engulfed his street. Not one, not two, but dozens of Harleys roaring like an army marching through the night. Headlights flickered across his yard as the line of bikes slowed, surrounding his little house with a glowing, growling presence. And then he saw them, Patched leather jackets, fierce insignias, men and women with hardened faces and soft eyes who looked right at him with something between respect and fury. The Hell's Angels had arrived. James blinked, unsure if he was dreaming, until the first rider cut his engine and called out, voice sharp as gravel, "Brother, we heard what you did." The day of the surgery had finally arrived, and Marcus sat in the waiting room with his head bowed, clutching his worn cap in his calloused hands, whispering prayers he hadn't uttered since the battlefield. His granddaughter Lily was behind closed doors, surrounded by surgeons and machines that hummed with life, while Marcus wrestled with guilt. Guilt for selling the only thing he had ever truly kept for himself. Guilt for not being able to protect his family from pain. Guilt for being an old man fighting a war he could never win alone. Hours crawled like years until a nurse emerged, her eyes soft and voice gentle, telling him that Lily had made it through, that the surgery was a success. Relief hit him like a wave, so heavy that he fell back into the chair, tears spilling down his cheeks. He thanked God, thanked the doctors, and even thanked his late wife under his breath for watching over their granddaughter. But as he stepped outside the hospital, the relief quickly tangled with dread. He knew the bills had only begun. The hospital had accepted the down payment from Harley's sale, but there were medications, therapies, and follow-ups he could barely dream of affording. His shoulders sagged as he walked back to his small home on the edge of town, expecting nothing but more burdens waiting for him. But when he turned onto his street, he froze. The rumble hit him first, a low, thunderous vibration that shook the pavement. He thought at first it was construction equipment or maybe some teenagers joyriding, but then the unmistakable sound of Harley-Davidsons filled the air. One by one, the motorcycles rolled into view, a wall of chrome and leather, patches gleaming in the afternoon sun. Neighbors peeked out of windows, dogs barked, and children ran to their porches as nearly 24 Hell's Angels roared down Marcus's street. They slowed as they approached his modest house, the engines growling like a pack of lions, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt the same electricity he used to feel before a firefight, the sense that something monumental was about to happen. The bikes came to a stop in perfect unison, lined up like an army on parade, and the street fell into a hushed silence broken only by the ticking of cooling engines. The leader, a tall man with a beard streaked with gray and a jacket patched with decades of road dust, swung his leg off his bike and started walking toward Marcus. Every step echoed, heavy with intention, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Marcus, still in his faded army jacket, straightened unconsciously, his back rigid like he was facing a commanding officer. The biker stopped just a foot away, looked Marcus in the eye, and extended his hand. "Brother," he said, his voice gravelly but warm, "we heard what you did for your little girl. You gave up your ride for her life. That ain't something a man forgets, and it sure as hell ain't something we let pass without respect." Marcus blinked, stunned, trying to process what was happening when the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He pressed it into Marcus's palm, firm and steady. Marcus hesitated, his hand trembling as he unfolded it, and his eyes widened at the sight, hundreds of dollars in cash, thick and heavy. Behind the leader, more bikers started stepping forward, each carrying something. Envelopes, grocery bags, toys, even small boxes wrapped in ribbon. It wasn't just money, it was food, supplies, gifts for Lily, and the kind of support Marcus had never dared to hope for. His throat tightened as his vision blurred, the scene melting into streaks of leather and chrome. He had fought wars for his country, stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers who had his back, but never once in civilian life had he felt this kind of brotherhood until now. The street, once quiet, erupted with cheers and claps from neighbors, children pointing at the rows of motorcycles like it was a parade. Marcus looked at the biker leader again, speechless, and the man gave him a nod that said everything without words. "You're not alone anymore." The sun rose over the small town with an unusual stillness, as if the world itself paused to witness what was about to unfold. Robert stood on his porch, his granddaughter asleep inside, when the first distant rumble broke the silence. At first it was faint, like a storm gathering far away, but soon the sound grew louder, rolling through the streets until windows rattled and neighbors peeked out in confusion. Down the main road came a line of motorcycles, chrome flashing, leather vests catching the light, engines roaring in unison like a battle cry. The Hell's Angels had arrived, not in chaos, not in menace, but in unity. They lined Robert's street shoulder to shoulder, parking one after another until the entire block was filled with gleaming bikes. Robert's eyes widened as a tall rider dismounted and walked toward him, helmet tucked under his arm, tattoos winding up his arms like stories carved into his skin. "Brother," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm, "we heard about your sacrifice. No veteran should ever have to choose between his pride and his family." Before Robert could speak, the riders began unloading bags, medicine, supplies, even an envelope heavy with donations. Some carried stuffed animals for his granddaughter, others food for the house. Tears welled in Robert's eyes as his hands trembled, overwhelmed by the sight of men society often feared, now standing as a shield. The leader clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm with unspoken respect. "You fought for this country. Now, let us fight for you." The roar of engines echoed again as the street transformed into a celebration of brotherhood, neighbors cheering, children waving, and Robert finally smiling through his tears. In that moment, the disabled veteran who once believed he had lost everything realized he had gained something far greater. An unbreakable family forged not by blood, but by honor, sacrifice, and the thunder of loyalty that filled his street that day. The next morning, John woke to the distant, unmistakable rumble of Harley engines, low, guttural, and rolling like thunder across the neighborhood. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding with confusion and disbelief, unsure if it was a dream or reality. Pulling back the curtain, he froze. The street outside was lined with motorcycles, row after row of chrome and black steel glistening under the morning sun, stretching further than his eyes could see. Men in leather vests, patched with the words Hell's Angels, stood shoulder to shoulder, engines idling as if the roar alone carried a message. John stepped outside cautiously, cane in hand, wearing his old army jacket, the same one he had kept since Vietnam. The crowd parted as a tall, broad man with a long, gray beard approached him, his vest heavy with patches that marked years of loyalty. He extended his hand, firm and unshaken, and said, "Brother, we heard what you did for your granddaughter." John tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. The man continued, "You sacrificed your bike for love, and that's something we don't ignore. That Harley was more than a machine, it was a piece of your soul. No man should ever have to choose between his steel and his family. So today we ride for her and for you." With that, the engines revved louder, a deafening symphony that echoed across the block, neighbors spilling out of their houses in awe. Some cheered, others simply stared, stunned by the sight of a notorious club rallying not for violence, but for compassion. One by one, members of the club handed John envelopes, thick with cash, and whispered words of respect. Tears filled his eyes as he realized what was happening. Not charity, but brotherhood, an unspoken pact of men who lived by loyalty above all else. He looked at the leader, barely able to steady his trembling voice, and said, "I don't know how to thank you." The man grinned beneath his beard, clapped John on the shoulder, and replied, "You already did, brother. You showed us what real sacrifice looks like." As the thunder of engines grew, John realized that for the first time in years he didn't feel alone. The roar of engines had faded from the neighborhood weeks ago, but the memory of that day still lingered in every corner of David's heart. His granddaughter, Maya, was recovering faster than anyone expected. The surgery had been a success, and her laughter once again filled the small house with warmth that David thought he might never hear again. Each time she ran across the living room, her tiny feet slapping against the wooden floor, David's chest swelled with pride and gratitude, though his mind often drifted back to the sight of his Harley rumbling down the street for the last time. Yet he didn't feel regret. He had made the only choice he could. The bike had carried him through storms, battles, and lonely nights after the war, but nothing in the world compared to the life of that little girl. Still, Life has a way of surprising those who give without expectation, and David's surprise came one warm Saturday morning when he heard a distant rumble of engines. At first, he thought it was only a group passing through town, but when the thunder grew closer, his heart began to race. He stepped onto the porch just in time to see a long line of Harleys, chrome gleaming, pipes roaring, turning into a street. And at the head of the pack was none other than Jack Grizzly Mason, flanked by the Hell's Angels who had shown him brotherhood in his darkest hour. The neighbors peeked through blinds and gathered on porches as the spectacle unfolded. The gang slowed to a crawl, forming a V down the road until they stopped in front of David's house. Jack dismounted, pulled off his helmet, and walked toward David with a grin that stretched across his weathered face. "Brother," he said, his voice carrying the weight of respect, "we figured you'd be missing a ride." With a nod from Jack, two bikers rolled forward, a gleaming black Harley, restored and polished beyond perfection. But it wasn't just any Harley, it was David's old one. The same bike he had sold to save Maya's life, now returned to him by the very men who understood sacrifice as deeply as he did. David's throat tightened as his hand brushed over the familiar leather seat. You brought her back," he whispered, his eyes glistening. Jack clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Some things belong where they started. And besides, every road you rode, every mile you gave her soul, it was still yours. We just made sure it found its way home." David felt his knees weaken, not from age, but from the flood of emotions washing over him. Maya, standing at the doorway in her little dress, ran out and hugged his leg. "Grandpa, is it your motorcycle? Can we ride it together one day?" she asked with innocent wonder. David lifted her into his arms, kissed her cheek, and smiled wider than he had in years. "Yes, baby girl. One day, when you're old enough, we'll ride." The crowd of bikers erupted into cheers, revving their engines in approval, while the neighborhood that once judged David for his rough edges now looked at him with awe. The Hell's Angels didn't just return his Harley, they gave him back a piece of his soul, a reminder that sacrifice never goes unnoticed and that true brotherhood runs deeper than blood. For David, it wasn't about the bike anymore. It was about the love of a granddaughter, the bond of brothers who refused to let him stand alone, and the realization that even when life takes, it often gives back in ways far greater than imagined. As the engines roared once more, echoing down the street like a promise, David climbed onto his Harley with Maya perched on his lap for just a short ride up and down the block. With the sun blazing above and the future wide open before them, he felt reborn a veteran.